What if I told you that buried beneath centuries of church doctrine and historical suppression lies a forbidden gospel that could completely rewrite everything you thought you knew about God's chosen people? What if this banned text, hidden away by ancient authorities who feared its revolutionary message, contains explosive revelations about the true identity of the Israelites that would shake the very foundations of modern Christianity? Tonight we're diving deep into one of history's most dangerous secrets, a gospel so threatening to established religious power that it was erased from official records and branded as heretical by the early church council. This isn't just another conspiracy theory or fringe religious movement. This is about a real manuscript discovered in circumstances that mirror the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, containing passages that speak of a chosen people with African origins, a covenant that extends far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Middle East, and a divine plan that includes nations and tribes that mainstream Christianity has ignored for nearly 2,000 years. The implications are staggering, the evidence is mounting, and the questions it raises will challenge everything you believe about biblical history, racial identity, and the true scope of God's redemptive plan. Are you ready to explore a truth so powerful that it was deemed too dangerous for the masses? Can you handle revelations that might transform your understanding of Scripture? Let me take you back to 1947, when Bedouin shepherds stumbled upon clay jars in the caves of Qumran, forever changing our understanding of ancient biblical. But what most people don't know is that similar discoveries have been made in recent decades, manuscripts that never made it into the headlines because their contents were too controversial, too threatening to established religious. One such text, discovered in the ruins of an ancient monastery in the Ethiopian highlands, contains passages that speak of the Segala, the treasured people, in ways that would revolutionize our understanding of biblical identity. This manuscript, written in a mixture of Aramaic and Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian liturgical language, describes encounters between early Christian missionaries and communities of dark-skinned people who claim direct descent from the tribes of Israel. The text speaks of their customs, their knowledge of Hebrew law, their preservation of ancient rituals that had been lost to mainstream Judaism, and, most shocking of all, their possession of genealogical records that trace their lineage back to the time of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Carbon dating places this manuscript between the 4th and 6th centuries CE, making it contemporary with other apocryphal texts that were excluded from the biblical canon. The writing style mirrors that of the Gospel of Thomas and other Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi, suggesting it emerged from the same tradition of alternative Christian thought that the early church worked so hard to suppress. The text refers to itself as the Besorah Nistarah, the hidden gospel, and claims to preserve teachings that were too sacred and too dangerous to be shared. What makes this text particularly intriguing is its detailed knowledge of Hebrew customs and biblical genealogies that would have been impossible for a medieval forgery to fabricate. It contains references to specific tribal migrations, detailed descriptions of temple rituals, and quotations from Hebrew texts that weren't widely available outside of Jewish communities. The manuscript describes communities in ancient Cush and Nubia who maintained Sabbath observance, practiced circumcision on the 8th day, and preserved oral traditions about their ancestors' journey from the land of Israel. The text also contains prophetic passages that speak of a time when the scattered children of Israel would be gathered from the four corners of the earth, including the land of Cush, which biblical scholars identify with ancient Ethiopia and Sudan. It quotes extensively from Isaiah 11:11, which speaks of the Lord recovering the remnant of his people from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and the islands of the sea. The manuscript suggests that this prophecy was already being fulfilled in the author's time through the preservation of Israelite communities in Africa. But perhaps the most explosive content in this forbidden gospel relates to the identity of the Messiah himself. The text describes Jesus as having the appearance of a man from Cush, with skin like burnished bronze and hair like wool, matching the description found in Revelation. It suggests that the Messiah's physical appearance was deliberately obscured by later Christian writers who wanted to make the gospel more acceptable to Greco-Roman audiences. The manuscript also contains detailed accounts of early Christian missions to Africa, describing thriving Christian communities among people who claimed Israelite heritage. It speaks of their knowledge of Hebrew scriptures, their observance of biblical festivals, and their preservation of ancient traditions that had been lost to European Christianity. The text suggests that these African Christian communities were the true inheritors of the apostolic tradition, maintaining practices and beliefs that were closer to original Christianity than what developed in Roman Constantinople. What makes this discovery even more significant is the reaction it provoked from religious authorities when it was first brought to light. Church officials immediately questioned its authenticity despite the manuscript's obvious antiquity and the scholarly consensus about its historical. Academic conferences were canceled, research funding was withdrawn, and scholars who attempted to study the text found themselves marginalized within their institutions. Can you imagine why this ancient testimony was so threatening to established religion? The story of the lost tribes of Israel has captivated biblical scholars and believers for centuries, but what if the conventional narrative about their disappearance is completely wrong? What if, instead of being absorbed into other populations and losing their identity, some of these tribes actually migrated south into Africa, where they preserved their Hebrew heritage for thousands of years? The evidence for this possibility is more compelling than most people realize, and it comes from sources that span archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and oral. Let's start with what we know from Scripture. Kings 7:6 tells us that the Assyrians carried Israel away into captivity, settling them in Halahaber, the river of Gozan, and the cities of the Maids. But this account only covers the official deportation policy of the Assyrian. What it doesn't tell us is what happened to the Israelites who escaped the initial conquest, who fled south in Egypt and beyond, or who were sold into slavery and transported to distant lands. Ancient Assyrian records discovered in the ruins of Nineveh contain detailed accounts of their military campaigns and deportation policies. These cuneiform tablets describe not just the official resettlement of conquered peoples, but also the extensive slave trade that followed their conquests. Thousands of Israelites were sold to merchants who transported them along established trade routes that extended deep into Africa. The Assyrians themselves had trading relationships with Nubian kingdoms, and archaeological evidence shows that goods and people moved regularly between Mesopotamia and the Upper Nile region. The Hebrew word gala, used to describe the exile of the northern tribes, doesn't just mean deportation to a specific location. It means scattering, dispersal, a spreading out in all directions. This suggests that the tribal migrations were far more extensive and complex than the simplified biblical account suggests. Some tribes went north and east into Assyrian territories, but others went south and west, following ancient trade routes that connected the Middle East with. Archaeological evidence supports this theory of southern migration. Excavations in ancient Elephantine and the Nile River near modern-day Aswan have uncovered a thriving Jewish community that existed from at least the 5th century. The Elephantine papyri, written in Aramaic, reveal a community that maintained Hebrew customs, observed biblical festivals, and even had their own temple where they offered sacrifices. But what's most intriguing is that this community claimed to have been established long before the Babylonian exile, suggesting that Jewish communities in Africa predated the more famous diaspora. Even more compelling is the evidence from the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, who maintained their Jewish identity for over 2,000 years in isolation from the rest of the Jewish world. Their oral traditions speak of their ancestors' journey from Jerusalem through Egypt and into the highlands of Ethiopia. They preserved Hebrew scriptures, observed biblical festivals, and maintained genealogical records that traced their lineage back to the tribe of Dan. When Israeli rabbis first encountered the Beta Israel in the 20th century, they were amazed by the authenticity of their Hebrew knowledge and the antiquity of their traditions. Genetic studies have provided additional support for the theory of ancient Israelite migration into Africa. The Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa have long claimed descent from ancient Israelites, and DNA analysis has confirmed that a significant percentage of Lemba men carry the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic marker associated with the Jewish priestly class. This genetic evidence suggests that their oral traditions about Israelite ancestry have a basis in biological reality. Similar genetic markers have been found among other African populations, including the Igbo people of Nigeria, who have maintained traditions about their Israelite origins for centuries. The Igbo language contains numerous Hebrew cognates. Their traditional religious practices mirror biblical customs, and their oral histories speak of their ancestors' journey from the Middle East through North Africa and into West Africa. When European slave traders arrived in the region, they found communities that practiced circumcision, observed dietary laws, and maintained weekly markets. that closed on Saturday, the biblical Sabbath. The linguistic evidence is equally compelling. Hebrew words and phrases have been preserved in various African languages, particularly in regions where communities claim Israelite heritage. The Yoruba people of Nigeria use the word Oluwa for God, which is remarkably similar to the Hebrew Elohim. The Akan people of Ghana have traditional names that correspond to Hebrew biblical names, and their religious festivals align with the biblical calendar in ways that suggest ancient connections. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from the oral traditions. Across Africa, from Ethiopia, Nigeria to Zimbabwe, there are communities that have preserved detailed stories about their ancestors' journey from the land of. These traditions speak of a great scattering, a time when their people were forced to flee their homeland and seek refuge in distant lands. They describe the preservation of sacred knowledge, the maintenance of ancient customs, and the hope of eventual return to their ancestral home. What makes these oral traditions particularly credible is their consistency across vast geographical distances and their preservation of specific details that would have been impossible to fabricate. They speak of the destruction of the temple, the journey through Egypt, the crossing of great rivers, and the establishment of new communities in the heart. They preserve the names of ancient leaders, the details of tribal genealogies, and the specifics of religious practices that align perfectly with biblical. The implications of this evidence are staggering. If the lost tribes of Israel did migrate into Africa, if they did preserve their Hebrew heritage for thousands of years, if they did maintain their identity as God's chosen people despite centuries of isolation and persecution, then the entire narrative of biblical history needs to be rewritten. The covenant wasn't limited to the Middle East. The chosen people weren't confined to a single geographical region. The promises of God extended far beyond the boundaries that traditional Christianity has recognized. But why has this evidence been ignored or suppressed for so long? Open your Bible to Acts chapter 8, and you'll encounter one of the most overlooked yet significant passages in the entire New Testament. Philip the evangelist meets an Ethiopian eunuch, a man of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home reading from the book of Isaiah. This isn't just a random encounter or a simple conversion story. This is a profound revelation about the extent of God's covenant people that has been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years. The Greek word used to describe this man is aethiops, which literally means burnt face, referring to the dark-skinned peoples of Africa. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this encounter. This Ethiopian official wasn't a pagan who had never heard of the God of Israel. He was already a worshiper, someone who had made the long and dangerous journey from Africa to Jerusalem to participate in Jewish religious festivals. He owned a scroll of Isaiah, one of the most expensive and rare possessions of the ancient world, and he was reading in Hebrew or Aramaic, languages that would have been foreign to most Gentiles. This suggests that there was already an established connection between the Ethiopian royal court and the Jewish faith, a connection that predated the Christian era by centuries. The Queen Mother Candace, whose title was actually Kandake in the Meroitic language, ruled over the kingdom of Cush, which encompassed modern-day Sudan and parts of Ethiopia. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that the Kushite kingdom had extensive trade relationships with the Middle East and that Jewish communities were already established in the region. But the Ethiopian eunuch's story becomes even more intriguing when we consider the passage he was reading. 7:8 speaks of the suffering servant who was led like a lamb to the slaughter, who was taken from prison and from judgment, whose generation no one could. When Philip asked if he understood what he was reading, the eunuch replied, "How can I unless someone guides me?" This wasn't ignorance about the Hebrew language or Jewish customs. This was a profound theological question about the identity of the Messiah and the nature of God's redemptive plan. The fact that this Ethiopian official was reading Isaiah suggests that he was already familiar with the prophetic literature that spoke of God's plan to gather his people from the ends of the earth. 11 specifically mentions Cush, the ancient name for the region this man represented as one of the places from which the Lord would recover the remnant of his people. 1:2 speaks of the land beyond the rivers of Cush, which sends ambassadors by sea in vessels of reed on the waters, describing a people tall and smooth-skinned, a people feared far and wide, a nation mighty and conquering. These passages suggest that the prophets understood God's covenant to extend far beyond the geographical boundaries of ancient Israel. They envisioned a time when the scattered children of Israel would be gathered from all nations, including the distant lands of Africa. The Ethiopian eunuch wasn't just a random Gentile who happened to encounter he was potentially a representative of communities that had maintained their connection to the God of Israel for generations. The Hebrew word Cush appears over 30 times in the Old Testament, always referring to the region south of Egypt that encompassed modern-day Sudan, and 31 prophecies that Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God, suggesting a special role for this region in God's redemptive plan. 3:10 speaks of God's worshippers from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia bringing offerings, indicating that there were already communities of believers in this, but perhaps the most significant biblical reference to African involvement in God's covenant comes from the story of Moses himself. One tells us that Moses married a Cushite woman, an Ethiopian, that his siblings Miriam and Aaron spoke against him because of this marriage. The Hebrew text uses the word Cushite, clearly identifying Moses' wife as an African woman. This marriage wasn't just a personal choice. It was a prophetic sign of the inclusion of African peoples in God's covenant. The implications of Moses' marriage to an Ethiopian woman are staggering when we consider the role of Moses as the lawgiver and covenant mediator. If the man who received the Torah at Mount Sinai, who established the priesthood and the sacrificial system, who led the children of Israel out of Egypt, was married to an African woman, then the covenant from its very beginning included African peoples. The children of Moses and his Ethiopian wife would have been part of the covenant community, carrying both Hebrew and African heritage. This connection becomes even more significant when we consider the role of the Levites, the priestly tribe of Israel. If Moses had children with his Ethiopian wife, and if those children were considered part of the Levitical line, then the priesthood itself would have included people of African descent. The Hebrew word Cohen, meaning priest, would have applied to individuals who carried both Hebrew and African genetic heritage. The book of Jeremiah contains another fascinating reference to African involvement in biblical history. Jeremiah 7:13 tells the story of Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, a eunuch in the king's house who rescued the prophet Jeremiah from a cistern where he was left to die. This Ethiopian official not only saved Jeremiah's life but was specifically blessed by God for his faithfulness. 16 records promise to Ebed-Melech, "I will deliver you in that day, says the Lord, and you shall not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are afraid, but I will surely deliver you, and you shall not fall by the sword, but your life shall be as a prize to you, because you have put your trust in me." The Hebrew name Ebed-Melech means servant of the king, but the fact that this Ethiopian eunuch was given such a position of trust in the royal court suggests that there were already established relationships between the kingdoms of Judah and Ethiopia. His willingness to risk his life to save Jeremiah indicates a deep understanding of and commitment to the God of Israel that goes beyond mere political alliance. These biblical accounts paint a picture of extensive connections between the Hebrew people and African nations that mainstream Christianity has largely. They suggest that from the very beginning of Israel's history, African peoples were included in God's covenant plan, not as outsiders who needed to be converted, but as integral participants in the unfolding drama of redemption. But if these connections were so clearly established in Scripture, why have they been overlooked or minimized by traditional Christian interpretation? The systematic erasure of African connections to biblical history didn't happen overnight. It was a calculated campaign that spanned centuries, involving church councils, colonial governments, and academic institutions that had vested interests in maintaining European supremacy over Christian narrative. What we're about to uncover will shock you, because it reveals how deliberate and extensive this cover-up really was, and how it continues to influence Christian thinking even today. The process began in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and began the transformation of a persecuted minority faith into the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE wasn't just about establishing orthodox doctrine regarding the Trinity. It was about creating a unified Christian identity that would serve the political needs of the empire. This meant standardizing not just theological beliefs, but also the cultural and racial imagery associated with Christianity. Early Christian art from the Roman catacombs shows a much more diverse representation of biblical figures than what would later become standard. Frescoes from the 2nd and 3rd centuries depict Jesus, Mary, and the apostles, with darker skin tones and African features, reflecting the multicultural reality of the early Christian communities. But as Christianity became the religion of the Roman elite, these authentic, depictions were gradually replaced with images that reflected European aesthetic preference. The Council of Carthage in 97 C, which established the biblical canon, made crucial decisions about which texts would be considered authoritative and which would be branded as heretical. Many of the excluded texts, including various Gospels and epistles that are now classified as apocryphal, contained references to African Christian communities and their claims of Israelite heritage. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and other early Christian writings that emphasized the African connections to biblical history were systematically suppressed. But the real acceleration of this cover-up came during the medieval period when European Christianity began to develop its crusading ideology. The Crusades weren't just military campaigns to reclaim the Holy Land from control. They were also ideological wars that sought to establish European Christianity as the sole legitimate heir to biblical tradition. This required not just the defeat of Islamic forces but also the marginalization of African Christian communities that had maintained their own interpretations of biblical history. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian denominations in the world, possessed manuscripts and traditions that contradicted the emerging European narrative about biblical identity. Their claims of Solomonic descent, their preservation of Hebrew customs, and their maintenance of Jewish Christian practices that had been abandoned by European Christianity posed a direct challenge to Roman Catholic authority. Rather than acknowledging these traditions as authentic expressions of early Christianity, European church leaders dismissed them as primitive corruptions of. The situation became even more dire during the Age of Exploration when European powers began their systematic colonization of Africa. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British colonial enterprises required ideological justification for the enslavement and exploitation of African people. Christianity provided that justification, but only if African peoples could be portrayed as spiritually inferior, as descendants of Ham who were cursed to be servants, as pagans who needed to be civilized through European Christian influence. The development of the transatlantic slave trade created enormous economic incentives for maintaining the fiction that African peoples had no legitimate connection to biblical history. If enslaved Africans were recognized as descendants of the biblical Israelites, if their claims of Hebrew heritage were acknowledged as authentic, if their preservation of ancient customs was seen as evidence of their covenant relationship with God, then the entire justification for slavery would collapse. Colonial missionaries played a crucial role in this cover-up by systematically destroying African historical records and suppressing indigenous traditions that contradicted European narratives. When missionaries encountered African communities that practiced circumcision, observed Sabbath, maintained dietary laws, and claimed descent from ancient Israel, they didn't celebrate these connections to biblical tradition. Instead, they worked to eradicate these practices and replace them with European Christian customs. The academic establishment became complicit in this cover-up through the development of racial theories that portrayed African peoples as inherently inferior and incapable of maintaining sophisticated religious traditions. European scholars argued that any similarities between African customs, biblical practices must be the result of later Islamic or European influence, not evidence of ancient Hebrew connections. They dismissed African oral traditions as unreliable mythology while treating European historical accounts as objective fact. The translation and interpretation of biblical texts also played a role in obscuring African connections to biblical history. Hebrew words like Cush and Mizraim, which clearly refer to African regions, were often translated in ways that minimized their geographical specificity. References to dark-skinned peoples in biblical texts were interpreted symbolically rather than literally, and passages that spoke of God's covenant extending to the ends of the earth were understood as metaphorical rather than geographical. The development of modern biblical archaeology, while uncovering tremendous evidence about ancient Middle Eastern civilizations, has consistently downplayed or ignored evidence of African involvement in biblical history. Archaeological sites in Sudan, Ethiopia, and other African regions that contain Hebrew inscriptions, Jewish ritual objects, and other evidence of ancient Israelite presence have received minimal attention from mainstream biblical scholars. Even more disturbing is the way that genetic research, which has provided compelling evidence of Hebrew ancestry among various African populations, has been marginalized or misinterpreted by academic institutions. Studies showing that groups like the Lemba people of Zimbabwe carry genetic markers associated with the Jewish priestly class have been treated as curiosities rather than a significant evidence of ancient Hebrew migration into Africa. The result of this centuries-long cover-up is that most Christians today have no idea about the extensive African connections to biblical history. They've been taught to see Christianity as a European religion, to imagine biblical figures as European in appearance, and to view African claims of Hebrew heritage as either delusional or fraudulent. This systematic erasure has not only distorted our understanding of biblical history but has also contributed to the marginalization and oppression of African peoples who have maintained their covenant identity despite centuries of. But the truth has a way of emerging despite efforts to suppress it, and new discoveries are forcing us to confront the reality of what has been hidden. The genetic revolution of the 21st century has provided us with tools that our ancestors could never have imagined, tools that can peer into the very building blocks of human identity and trace the movements of peoples across thousands of years of history. What these tools are revealing about the connections between African populations and ancient Hebrew peoples is absolutely staggering, and it's forcing us to completely reconsider everything we thought we knew about biblical genealogy and the identity of God's chosen people. The breakthrough came in the 1990s when geneticists began studying the Y chromosome markers of Jewish populations around the world. They discovered that despite being scattered across different continents for nearly 2,000 years, Jewish men from diverse geographical locations shared common genetic signatures that pointed to a shared Middle Eastern ancestry. But what they also discovered, much to their surprise, was that some of these same genetic markers appeared in African populations that had no known connection to mainstream Jewish communities. The most dramatic example came from studies of the Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa. For generations, the Lemba had maintained oral traditions claiming descent from ancient Israelites who had migrated into Africa. They practiced circumcision, observed dietary restrictions similar to kosher laws, and maintained a weekly day of rest that corresponded to the biblical. But mainstream anthropologists had dismissed these traditions as either borrowed from later contact with Jewish traders or as coincidental similarities that had no historical significance. Then came the genetic testing. Treeford Jenkins of the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa conducted chromosome analysis on Lemba men and discovered something that shocked the scientific community. A significant percentage of Lemba males carried the cone modal haplotype, a genetic signature associated with the Jewish priestly class. This wasn't just a vague similarity or a statistical coincidence. This was a specific genetic marker that is found almost exclusively among men who claim descent from the biblical Aaron, the first high priest of Israel. The implications were staggering. Here was scientific proof that an African population carried the genetic heritage of the ancient Hebrew priesthood. The Lemba weren't just preserving cultural traditions that resembled Jewish practice. They were literally carrying the DNA of the biblical Levites, the tribe that was set apart by God to serve in the temple and maintain the sacrificial system. But the Lemba were just the beginning. Subsequent genetic studies have revealed Hebrew ancestry markers among numerous African populations, including the Igbo people of Nigeria, the Akan people of Ghana, and various Ethiopian communities. The pattern that emerges from these studies is consistent and undeniable. Significant numbers of African peoples carry genetic signatures that link them directly to ancient Middle Eastern populations, specifically to the regions and time periods associated with biblical Israel. The Igbo people of Nigeria present a particularly compelling case. With a population of over 40 million, the Igbo represent one of the largest ethnic groups in Africa. Their oral traditions speak of their ancestors' migration from the Middle East, and their cultural practices include numerous elements that mirror biblical. They practice a form of circumcision that follows biblical timing. They observe market days that align with the biblical calendar, and they maintain clan structures that correspond to the tribal system described in the Hebrew scriptures. When geneticists began studying Ejibalduna, they found evidence of significant Middle Eastern ancestry, particularly markers that are associated with ancient Hebrew populations. The genetic data suggests that the Igbo ancestors included peoples who migrated from the Levant region during the time periods that correspond to the biblical accounts of Israeli dispersal. This isn't just speculation or wishful thinking. This is hard scientific evidence that validates oral traditions that have been maintained for thousands of years. The Ethiopian connection is equally compelling. The Beta Israel or Ethiopian Jews have maintained their Jewish identity for over 2 millennia despite being isolated from other Jewish communities. Their genetic profile shows clear Middle Eastern ancestry with markers that link them to ancient Hebrew populations. But what's even more interesting is that other Ethiopian populations, including groups that don't identify as Jewish, also carry genetic signatures that suggest Hebrew ancestry. This pattern of Hebrew genetic markers appearing in African populations that maintain traditions of Israelite descent is found across the continent. The Yoruba people of Nigeria, the Ashanti of Ghana, the Hausa of northern Nigeria, and numerous other groups all show evidence of ancient Middle Eastern ancestry combined with oral traditions that speak of Hebrew origins. The genetic evidence is so consistent and widespread that it's becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence or contamination. But perhaps the most significant genetic revelation comes from studies of African American populations. Research conducted by geneticists studying the ancestry of enslaved Africans has revealed that many of the regions from which slaves were taken had populations with significant Hebrew genetic markers. This means that millions of African Americans may be carrying Hebrew now without even knowing it, that their ancestors may have been practicing forms of Hebrew religion before they were captured and transported to the Americas. The implications of this genetic evidence extend far beyond academic curiosity. If significant numbers of African peoples are indeed descendants of ancient Hebrew populations, if they have maintained their covenant identity despite centuries of persecution and displacement, if their oral traditions about Israeli ancestry are validated by scientific evidence, then the entire narrative of biblical history needs to be rewritten. The covenant wasn't limited to a small population in the Middle East. The chosen people weren't confined to a single geographical region. The promises of God were preserved and maintained by communities that mainstream Christianity has ignored or dismissed for centuries. The genetic evidence suggests that the diaspora of Israel was far more extensive than traditional accounts acknowledge, that Hebrew communities established themselves throughout Africa and maintained their identity even as they adapted to new environments and circumstances. This genetic revolution is forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about the assumptions that have shaped our understanding of biblical history. If African peoples are indeed descendants of ancient Israel, if they have maintained their covenant relationship with God despite centuries of oppression, if their claims of Hebrew heritage are validated by scientific evidence, then what does this mean for the way we understand God's plan for humanity? The Dina doesn't lie, and what it's telling us is that the story of God's people is far more complex, far more inclusive, and far more African than we ever. Across America today, from the streets of New York to the neighborhoods of Atlanta, from the communities of Chicago to the cities of California, remarkable awakening is taking place. African Americans are discovering connections to their ancestral heritage that go far deeper than the trauma of slavery and the struggle for civil rights. They're uncovering evidence that their roots extend back to the very foundations of biblical history, that their ancestors may have been among the original children of Israel, and that their identity as God's chosen people isn't just a spiritual metaphor but a historical reality. This awakening didn't happen overnight. It's been building for decades through the work of scholars, activists, and spiritual leaders who refuse to accept the conventional narrative about African American origins. They've been studying ancient texts, analyzing genetic evidence, researching oral traditions, and connecting dots that mainstream academia has ignored or dissed. What they've discovered is a story so compelling, so well documented, and so transformative that it's beginning to reshape how millions of people understand their place in God's plan. The Hebrew Israelite movement, in its various forms, represents one of the most significant spiritual and cultural developments in modern African American. Unlike traditional Christianity, which often portrayed African Americans as spiritual outsiders who needed to be grafted in God's covenant through faith, the Hebrew Israelite movement teaches that African Americans are the literal descendants of the biblical Israelites, that they are the true chosen people of, and that their enslavement and oppression were fulfillments of biblical prophecy, rather than random historical events. This isn't just a theological position. It's a complete reframing of identity that has profound implications for how African Americans understand their history, their culture, and their destiny. Instead of seeing themselves as the descendants of pagans who were civilized through European Christianity, Hebrew Israelites see themselves as the descendants of the people who gave the world the Torah, the prophets, and the Messiah. Instead of viewing their suffering as meaningless tragedy, they see it as the fulfillment of biblical curses that were pronounced upon Israel for disobedience. practical. The movement draws heavily on biblical passages that describe the scattering and suffering of the Israelites. Deuteronomy 60 speaks of the Israelites being brought back to Egypt in ships sold as slaves and finding no buyers. Hebrew Israelites point out that this prophecy was literally fulfilled when millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic in slave ships and sold in markets throughout the Americas. They see the Middle Passage not as a random act of human cruelty but as the fulfillment of divine judgment upon a people who had turned away from God's law. But the movement isn't just about identifying with biblical suffering. It's also about reclaiming biblical promises and preparing for biblical regression. Hebrew Israelites believe that the time of punishment is ending, that God is beginning to awaken his people to their true identity, and that the restoration of Israel will involve not just the return to the physical land but the spiritual awakening of the scattered tribes wherever they may be found. This awakening is being facilitated by modern technology in ways that would have been impossible in previous generations. Social media platforms, YouTube channels, and online communities are connecting Hebrew Israelites across the globe, sharing research, discussing interpretations, and building networks of support and education. The same internet that has been used to spread so much misinformation and division is also being used to uncover and share truths that have been hidden for centuries. The genetic revolution has provided Hebrew Israelites with scientific validation for claims that were once dismissed as fantasy. When DNA testing reveals Hebrew ancestry among African populations, when genetic markers confirm oral traditions about Israelite descent, when scientific evidence supports cultural and religious practices that have been maintained for generations, it becomes much harder to dismiss the movement as delusional or fraudulent. Educational institutions are beginning to take notice as well. Universities that once ignored or marginalized research into African connections to biblical history are now funding studies, hosting conferences, and publishing papers that explore these connections. The academic establishment is slowly recognizing that the story of human migration and cultural development is far more complex than traditional narratives have suggested. The movement is also having a significant impact on how African Americans understand their relationship to other communities. Instead of seeing themselves as perpetual victims seeking acceptance from white society, many Hebrew Israelites see themselves as members of a chosen people who have a unique role to play in God's plan for humanity. This shift in perspective has profound implications for everything from political activism to economic development to cultural expression. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the modern Hebrew Israelite movement is its emphasis on returning to biblical law and practice. Unlike mainstream Christianity, which often treats the Old Testament as outdated or superseded by the New Testament, Hebrew Israelites see the Torah as eternally binding and relevant. They observe the Sabbath on Saturday, celebrate biblical festivals like Passover and Sukkot, follow dietary laws, and study Hebrew as a way of connecting with their ancestral heritage. This return to biblical practice isn't just about religious observance. It's about cultural restoration, about reclaiming an identity that was stolen through centuries of oppression and miseducation. When Hebrew Israelites put on prayer shawls, light Sabbath candles, and study ancient texts, they're not just performing religious rituals. They're reconnecting with a heritage that predates slavery, that transcends the limitations imposed by racism, and that offers hope for a future that is grounded in divine promise rather than human approval. The movement is also producing a new generation of scholars, teachers, and leaders who are equipped to engage with both ancient texts and modern research. These individuals are not content to simply accept traditional interpretations of biblical history. They're doing their own research, asking their own questions, and coming to their own conclusions about the identity of God's people and the meaning of biblical prophecy. What makes this movement particularly powerful is its combination of spiritual conviction and intellectual rigor. Hebrew Israelites aren't just making emotional appeals or relying on wishful. They're presenting evidence, citing sources, and building arguments that are increasingly difficult to refute. They're forcing mainstream Christianity and Judaism to confront questions that have been avoided for centuries. The implications of this awakening extend far beyond the African American community. If Hebrew Israelites are correct about their identity, if African Americans are indeed descendants of the biblical Israelites, if the covenant promises apply to them as much as to any other group, then the entire landscape of American religion and culture will need to be reconsidered. But this awakening is also creating tensions and controversies that need to be Addressed honestly and thoughtfully, the Hebrew Israelite movement has sparked intense debates that go to the very heart of American religious and racial identity. These aren't just academic discussions taking place in university classrooms or theological seminary. These are passionate, sometimes heated exchanges that are happening in churches, community centers, and online forums across the country. The stakes are high because the questions being raised challenge fundamental assumptions about history, identity, and divine purpose that have shaped American society for centuries. One of the most contentious issues involves the relationship between Hebrew Israelites and mainstream Jewish communities. Some Hebrew Israelite groups have made claims that are deeply offensive to Jewish people, suggesting that modern Jews are imposters who have stolen the identity of the true Israelites. These claims often rely on theories about the Khazar conversion to Judaism or other historical narratives that have been used to delegitimize Jewish identity and justify antisemitism. It's crucial to understand that these extreme positions don't represent the entire Hebrew Israelite movement. Many Hebrew Israelite scholars and leaders explicitly reject anti-Semitic rhetoric and instead focus on the evidence for African Hebrew ancestry without denying the legitimacy of other Jewish communities. They argue that the covenant was never exclusive to a single ethnic group, that the biblical promises were intended for all of Abraham's descendants, and that the discovery of Hebrew ancestry among African populations should be celebrated as evidence of God's inclusive plan, rather than used as a weapon against other communities. The genetic evidence actually supports this more inclusive interpretation. DNA studies have shown that Jewish populations around the world, including Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi communities, share common Middle Eastern ancestry that links them to the ancient Hebrew peoples. At the same time, these studies have also revealed Hebrew genetic markers among various African populations. Rather than proving that one group is legitimate and another is not, the genetic evidence suggests that the Hebrew diaspora was far more extensive and diverse than previously understood. Another major controversy involves the relationship between Hebrew Israelite teachings and mainstream Christianity. Many Christian leaders have expressed concern about Hebrew Israelite claims that traditional Christianity is a false religion that was imposed upon African peoples to keep them in spiritual bondage. Some Hebrew Israelite teachers argue that Jesus was a black Hebrew who came specifically to redeem the lost tribes of Israel, and that the gospel message was corrupted by European influences that transformed it into a tool of oppression. These claims create significant tension within African American Christian communities, where many people are deeply committed to traditional Christian faith while also being drawn to the Hebrew Israelite message of cultural and spiritual restoration. The challenge is finding ways to honor both the authentic spiritual experiences that people have had within Christianity and the legitimate questions that Hebrew Israelite research has raised about the historical development of Christian doctrine. Some scholars have suggested that the conflict between Hebrew Israelite and Christian perspectives may be based on false dichotomies. They argue that early Christianity was much more diverse than later. Institutional developments would suggest that Jewish Christian communities maintain Hebrew practices for centuries after the time of Jesus, and that the separation between Judaism and Christianity was a gradual process that was influenced by political and cultural factors as much as theological. The academic establishment has also struggled with how to respond to Hebrew Israelite claims and research. Traditional biblical scholarship has been dominated by European and European American perspectives that have often ignored or marginalized African contributions to biblical history. When Hebrew Israelite scholars present evidence of African connections to biblical peoples, they're often dismissed as lacking proper academic credentials, or as being motivated by ideology rather than objective research. But this dismissal is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the evidence continues to mount. Genetic studies, archaeological discoveries, and linguistic research are all pointing towards significant African involvement in biblical history. The challenge for the academic establishment is how to acknowledge this evidence without admitting that their previous interpretations were incomplete or biased. The political implications of Hebrew Israelite claims are also controversial. If African Americans are indeed descendants of the biblical Israelites, if they have maintained their covenant identity despite centuries of oppression, if their suffering was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy rather than random historical tragedy, then this has profound implications for how American society understands issues of race, reparations, and social justice. Some Hebrew Israelite leaders have argued that recognition of their true Identity should lead to specific political and economic remedies, including reparations for slavery, land grants, and special recognition of their status as indigenous peoples. These claims are controversial because they challenge existing power structures and demand accountability for historical injustices in ways that make many people uncomfortable. The media has often focused on the most extreme and controversial aspects of the Hebrew Israelite movement while ignoring the serious scholarship and legitimate questions that the movement has raised. This selective coverage has contributed to public misunderstanding and has made it more difficult to have honest conversations about the evidence and its implication. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth that the Hebrew Israelite movement has forced American society to confront is the extent to which racial assumptions have shaped religious and historical interpretation. The idea that biblical peoples were primarily European in appearance, that African peoples had no significant role in biblical history, that Christianity is fundamentally European religion. These assumptions have been so deeply embedded in American culture that challenging them feels like an attack on fundamental beliefs. But if we're committed to truth, if we're willing to follow the evidence, wherever it leads, if we're open to the possibility that our understanding of biblical history has been incomplete or distorted, then we have to be willing to confront these uncomfortable truths. We have to be willing to acknowledge that African peoples may have played a much more significant role in biblical history than we've been taught. We have to be willing to consider that the covenant promises may extend to communities that we've ignored or marginalized. We have to be willing to admit that our religious and cultural narratives may need to be revised in light of new evidence. This doesn't mean accepting every claim made by every Hebrew Israelite teacher or group. It doesn't mean abandoning critical thinking or scholarly rigor. It doesn't mean embracing anti-Semitism or rejecting the legitimacy of other community. But it does mean being open to the possibility that the story of God's people is more complex, more inclusive, and more African than we've been willing to. The controversies surrounding the Hebrew Israelite movement are ultimately about more than historical accuracy or religious doctrine. They're about identity, belonging, and the right to define one's own relationship with the divine. They're about the power to interpret sacred texts and the authority to determine who belongs to God's covenant community. These are not easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they are questions that we can no longer avoid because the evidence is mounting and the awakening is spreading. As we stand at the crossroads of history, genetics, and faith, we're witnessing something unprecedented in human experience. The convergence of ancient prophecy, modern science, and spiritual awakening is creating possibilities that our ancestors could never have imagined. The Hebrew Israelite movement, the genetic discoveries, the archaeological evidence, and the spiritual hunger of millions of people are all pointing toward a future where our understanding of biblical history, racial identity, and divine purpose will be fundamentally transformed. The implications of what we've discovered extend far beyond academic curiosity or religious debate. If the evidence continues to mount that significant numbers of African peoples are descendants of the biblical Israelites, if their oral traditions are validated by scientific research, if their cultural practices are recognized as authentic expressions of ancient Hebrew faith, then we're looking at a complete rewriting of the narrative that has shaped Western civilization for over 1,000 years. This transformation is already beginning to happen in ways that are both subtle and dramatic. Churches across America are grappling with questions about the racial identity of biblical figures, the African connections to biblical history, and the implications of genetic research for understanding God's covenant people. Seminary curricula are being revised to include more diverse perspectives on biblical interpretation. Archaeological expeditions are paying more attention to African sites that may contain evidence of ancient Hebrew presence. The younger generation is leading this transformation in many ways. African American young people who have grown up with access to genetic testing, social media, and alternative educational resources are asking questions that their parents and grandparents never thought to ask. They're not content to accept traditional narratives about their origins, and they're doing their own research, drawing their own conclusions, and demanding answers that are grounded in evidence rather than assumption. This generational shift is creating both opportunities and challenges for religious institutions, churches that are willing to engage honestly with these questions, that are open to revising their understanding of biblical history, that are committed to following the evidence wherever it leads, are finding new relevance and But churches that resist these conversations, that dismiss legitimate questions as heretical or divisive, that cling to outdated interpretations despite mounting evidence to the contrary, are finding themselves increasingly marginalized. The genetic revolution is also creating new possibilities for understanding human migration, cultural development, and religious evolution. As DNA testing becomes more sophisticated and more widely available, we're likely to discover even more connections between African populations and ancient Hebrew peoples. We may find evidence of Hebrew communities in regions of Africa that have never been explored by biblical archaeologists. We may uncover genetic markers that provide even more specific information about tribal affiliations and migration patterns. These discoveries will force us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of identity itself. If someone carries Hebrew genetic markers, does that make them Jewish? If they maintain Hebrew cultural practices, does that validate their claim to Israeli identity? If they identify spiritually with the covenant promises, does that make them part of God's chosen people? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're questions that we'll increasingly need to address as the evidence continues to accumulate. The international implications of these discoveries are also significant. If Hebrew Israelite claims are validated by continuing research, it could affect everything from Middle East politics to African development to global religious. Countries with significant populations that claim Hebrew ancestry may begin to assert new roles in international affairs. Religious organizations may need to reconsider their understanding of who belongs to the covenant community and what that means for their mission and ministry. The educational implications are equally profound. If African peoples played a more significant role in biblical history than traditional narratives have acknowledged, then curricula in schools, universities, and religious institutions will need to be revised. Students will need to learn about the African connections to biblical peoples, the evidence for Hebrew ancestry among various African populations, and the implications of these discoveries for understanding human history and divine purpose. But perhaps the most significant implication of these discoveries is what they mean for the future of faith itself. If the covenant promises extend to communities that have been marginalized or ignored, if God's chosen people include populations that have been oppressed and dismissed, if the divine plan is more inclusive and more global than we've understood, then our entire approach to religion, spirituality, and human relationships will need to be reconsidered. This doesn't mean abandoning traditional faith or rejecting established religious institutions, but it does mean being open to the possibility that our understanding of faith has been incomplete, that our interpretation of Scripture has been limited by cultural assumptions, that our vision of God's plan has been constrained by human prejudices and historical circumstances. The Hebrew Israelite movement, whatever its flaws and controversies, has forced us to ask essential questions about identity, belonging, and divine purpose. It has challenged us to look beyond the surface of traditional narratives and to dig deeper into the evidence of history, genetics, and spiritual experience. It has reminded us that the story of God's people is far more complex and far more inclusive than we've been taught. As we move forward into this new era of discovery and understanding, we have choices to make. We can resist the evidence and cling to comfortable assumptions, or we can embrace the challenge of expanding our vision of God's plan. We can dismiss legitimate questions as divisive or threatening, or we can engage with them honestly and thoughtfully. We can continue to marginalize communities that claim Hebrew ancestry, or we can take their claims seriously and investigate them with the rigor they deserve. The future of faith may well depend on our willingness to follow the evidence, wherever it leads, to acknowledge comfortable truths about our past, and to embrace a more inclusive understanding of God's covenant people. The banned gospel that we've explored tonight may be just the beginning of revelations that will transform our understanding of biblical history and divine. The genetic evidence is mounting, the archaeological discoveries are accumulating, the oral traditions are being validated, and the spiritual awakening is spreading. We're living through a moment of unprecedented opportunity to uncover truths that have been hidden for centuries, to restore identities that have been stolen or suppressed, and to expand our understanding of what it means to be God's chosen people. But this opportunity comes with responsibility. We must approach these discoveries with humility, recognizing that our understanding is still incomplete and that new evidence may require us to revise our conclusion. We must engage with these questions in ways that build bridges rather than walls, that promote understanding rather than division, that honor the dignity and worth of all people regardless of their ancestry or identity. We must also remember that ultimately, the question of who belongs to God's covenant community is not determined by genetics alone, but by faith, obedience, and relationship with the divine. The Hebrew Israelite movement has reminded us that identity matters, that history matters, that ancestry matters. But it has also reminded us that God's love and grace extend to all people, regardless of their ethnic background or cultural heritage. As we conclude this exploration of the banned gospel and its revelations about the secret black Israelites, I want to challenge you to continue this journey of discovery. Read the ancient text for yourself. Examine the genetic evidence. Study the archaeological findings. Listen to the oral traditions. Engage with the questions that these discoveries raise, even when they make you uncomfortable. Most importantly, approach these questions with an open heart and a commitment. Don't let fear, prejudice, or comfortable assumptions prevent you from following the evidence wherever it leads. Don't let the controversies and conflicts surrounding these issues prevent you from engaging with the legitimate questions they raise. The story of God's people is still being written, and you have a role to play in uncovering and sharing the truth. Whether you're African American, European American, or from any other background, you have a stake in understanding the full scope of biblical history and divine purpose. The covenant promises may be more inclusive than we've understood. The chosen, the people may be more diverse than we've acknowledged, and the plan of God may be more global than we've imagined. Tell us what you think about these revelations in the comments below. Share this video with others who are seeking truth and understanding. Subscribe to our channel for more explorations of hidden biblical mysteries and forgotten histories. The banned gospel has been revealed, the secret has been uncovered, and the truth is spreading. The question is whether you'll be part of the awakening or whether you'll remain asleep to the possibilities that these discoveries represent. The future of faith is being written right now, and you have the opportunity to be part of that story. Will you take up the challenge? Will you join the search for truth? Will you help uncover the hidden connections between ancient prophecy and modern? The choice is yours, but the time for decision is now. The banned gospel has spoken, and its message is clear. The story of God's people is far more amazing, far more inclusive, and far more African than we ever dared to imagine.